Hey everyone, go ahead and dim the lights. Maybe grab a cup of tea. Or don't. Just let your phone rest on your pillow and let's glide together into a few thousand years of dusty roads, exhausted camels, and kings who really thought they were changing the world by inventing taxes on silk. Tonight, we're taking a slow, meandering walk along the Silk Road. Not the modern, buy cheap stuff from a shady website Silk Road. The real one. The ancient, creaky, world-connecting highway of trade, greed, curiosity, and occasional dysentery. You can imagine it. A narrow trail cutting through endless sand and rock from China's Han Dynasty heartlands all the way to the shimmering markets of the Mediterranean. People trudging through deserts just to sell shiny fabric. And of course, doing it in the name of civilization, profit, or sometimes just because someone told them there might be spices at the other end. So let's take it slow. We'll float through centuries, meeting emperors, merchants, monks, and the occasional accidental explorer who took the wrong turn and somehow discovered something someone else already knew about. Because, really, that's half of history. Let's start where it all technically begins. China, around the 2nd century BCE. The Han Dynasty was in full swing. Silk was the hot commodity, and the imperial court had a new obsession: expanding trade and power. Now, silk wasn't exactly new. The Chinese had been spinning it since at least 3000 BCE, basically since prehistoric influencer fashion became a thing. It was their best-kept secret, literally. Revealing how to make silk was punishable by death. And you know what? Fair enough. If I had invented the softest, most luxurious fabric on the planet, I wouldn't want my neighbors copying it either. At first, silk was mostly a domestic status symbol. You wore it to show you weren't a farmer. But as Chinese dynasties got more ambitious, they realized other people might actually pay for this shiny miracle thread. And so began the first whispers of what would become the Silk Road. Of course, the Han emperors didn't exactly open a global trade hub overnight. It started awkwardly, like most first attempts at international relations. Around 138 BCE, Emperor Wu of Han sent a diplomat named Zhang Qin westward to look for allies against nomadic tribes called the Xiongnu, the type of people who were very good at horseback warfare and very bad at respecting Chinese borders. Zhang Qin set out full of optimism and official seals, and within about 5 minutes, he was captured. For 10 years. But eventually, he escaped, as one does, and returned home not with allies, but with knowledge. He brought back tales of lands far to the west, kingdoms, horses, and strange goods like glass and grapes. Yes, grapes, which the Chinese promptly decided were a big deal. Because now, finally, wine. Wu of Han, never one to miss a potential revenue stream, saw an opportunity. And so began the first official opening of trade routes stretching from China towards Central Asia. The Silk Road wasn't just one road, though. It was a network, a messy web of trails that wound through deserts, oases, and mountain passes. Think of it less like a highway and more like a chaotic group chat where everyone's selling something and no one's sure who started it. So what exactly was traded? Obviously, silk. It was the luxury item everyone wanted but couldn't make. Roman emperors would later complain that their citizens were wasting fortunes on these delicate fabrics that were, quote, see-through. Scandalous. But silk was just the start. Along the Silk Road came spices, gems, glassware, paper, and in the most surprising turn, ideas. Buddhism, for example, spread from India to China along these same dusty routes, carried not by armies, but by quiet monks with scrolls and sandals. It's strange to think that something as peaceful as Buddhism traveled on the same trails used by bandits and tax collectors, but that's the Silk Road for you. A weird blend of enlightenment and extortion. Let's take a slow step westward now, past the deserts of the Taklamakan, a place whose name literally means you go in and don't come out, which is both poetic and not great marketing. Merchants traveled in caravans, partly for protection and partly because misery loves company. They stopped at oasis cities like Dunhuang, where they could refill their water, pray to any deity that would listen, and sell whatever hadn't been stolen yet. Dunhuang became more than just a pit stop. It turned into an artistic hub, filled with cave temples carved into cliffs, covered in murals of Buddhas, donors, demons, and the occasional awkwardly drawn horse. Imagine it. A silent desert temple glowing with oil lamps, filled with the scent of incense and traveler's dust. Somewhere, a monk is copying a sutra, while a trader outside hargles over the price of pepper. The Silk Road was full of these contradictions: devotion and greed, art and exhaustion. And then, further west, we meet the Parthians, the middlemen of history. These were the people who really made the Silk Road work, mainly by marking up prices until no one in Rome knew what silk actually cost to make. They controlled much of Iran and Mesopotamia, sitting right between the Romans and the Chinese, and they liked it that way. Trade passed through their lands, and they took a nice, comfortable cut of everything. You could almost say the Parthians were the world's first logistics experts. Or, if you're less generous, professional toll collectors. Either way, they kept the Silk Road humming. Meanwhile, in the Roman Empire, people started going absolutely wild for silk. Roman writers couldn't stop complaining about it. Seneca, Pliny the Elder, all of them wrote long, angry rants about how silk was making Roman morals disintegrate, because apparently transparent clothing was the end of civilization. Pliny even claimed that Roman gold was flowing east like a river, paying for these Chinese fabrics, which is probably true. The Romans had no idea where silk came from, though. They thought it grew on trees, which is honestly adorable. Imagine being a Roman senator, sitting in your marble villa, shaking your head and saying, "Those silk farmers must have quite the orchard." As centuries drifted by, the Silk Road became not just a trade route, but a cultural superhighway. Languages mixed, religions spread, art styles fused into strange, beautiful hybrids. Central Asian cities like Samarkand and Bukhara turned into glittering cosmopolitan hubs where Persian poets, Indian monks, and Chinese diplomats could all share a meal, probably one covered in way too much saffron. Because nothing says romance like centuries of economic exploitation. As we near the end of this first part, let's pause for a moment and just picture the Silk Road at its peak. A caravan moving slowly through the desert at sunset, bells jingling on the camels, the air warm and dry. The merchants half asleep dreaming of home and profits. 1,000 miles away, in Rome or Chang'an, someone is unrolling a bolt of silk, smooth, shimmering, impossibly light. And they're not thinking about the hundreds of hands that touched it, the languages spoken, or the lives lost along the way. They're just admiring how pretty it looks in the lamplight. That, in a way, was the real Silk Road. Not a single route or empire, but a quiet hum of human connection stretched thin across continents. In Part 2, we'll drift deeper into the later centuries: Mongols, Marco Polo, Black Death, in the gentlest possible way, and how the Silk Road eventually gave way to ships, maps, and new global trade routes. But for now, just close your eyes, imagine the desert wind, and let's rest before we cross another mountain pass.
Welcome back. Hopefully, you've settled in deeper under the blanket. Maybe the tea's gone cold by now. That's fine, it suits the mood. Tonight, we keep moving west, following the dusty footprints of merchants who never seemed to learn that desert travel was, in fact, terrible. Last time, we left the Silk Road at its glittering peak. Cities thriving, trade humming, everyone quietly overcharging each other. But, of course, history being what it is, things were about to get turbulent. And by turbulent, I mean the Mongols. Now, say what you will about the Mongols, and historians have said a lot, but if you wanted trade routes secured, there was no one better. Yes, they destroyed plenty of cities, burned a few empires, and committed some light to moderate world conquering. But after the chaos came something remarkable: stability. When Genghis Khan and his descendants carved out their enormous empire in the 13th century, they unintentionally created one of the safest, most efficient trade environments the Silk Road had ever seen. They called it the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace, which sounds suspiciously like "don't make us come back there." Under Genghis and later Kublai Khan, the Silk Road thrived again. Merchants could travel from China to Persia under a single imperial authority. Bandits dealt with. Local tolls standardized. Bureaucrats everywhere. Because what's the point of ruling half the known world if you can't generate some paperwork? The Mongols even created a system of relay stations, rest stops stocked with food, water, and fresh horses, that stretched across thousands of miles. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a highway service station with more yurts and fewer vending machines. And for a brief, shining century, you could actually get from one end of Asia to the other without being robbed, lost, or accidentally conquered. This is also the era when we meet one of history's most famous travelers, Marco Polo. Ah, yes, the Venetian merchant who basically did what every travel blogger dreams of: go to Asia, have a few wild experiences, and then come home and exaggerate everything. Marco set out with his father and uncle around 1271, made it all the way to China, and spent years in the service of Kublai Khan. At least, that's what he said. Historians still debate how much of his story is true, but it's undeniably a great read. His descriptions of silk markets, porcelain, spices, and glittering cities like Khanbalik, modern-day Beijing, captured Europe's imagination. Though, of course, his audience probably listened while thinking, "That's nice, but what's a Mongol?" Still, Marco's book became a sort of travel brochure for future explorers, a dreamy account of endless wealth and strange customs, written by a man who mostly wanted everyone to know he'd eaten things they hadn't. Now, while all this trade was booming, there was also, let's say, an unintended consequence. Because when you have a network that connects half the world, it doesn't just move silk and spices, it also moves germs. Yes, we've arrived at the Black Death portion of the evening. Don't worry, we'll tread lightly. The plague of the 14th century, which wiped out an estimated third of Europe's population, likely traveled westward along the same trade routes that carried silk and silver. Ships and caravans alike carried rats, and the rats carried fleas, and the fleas carried bacteria that did not care about economic growth. It's one of those moments where you realize the Silk Road connected the world, for better and for worse. A true global network, centuries before anyone had Wi-Fi or hand sanitizer. But let's not dwell too much on mortality. It's bad for sleep. Let's instead look at the bright side. Innovation. As the Mongol Empire stabilized long-distance trade, ideas flowed like never before. Chinese inventions like paper, gunpowder, and the compass drifted westward. In return, Central Asia and the Islamic world sent back advances in astronomy, mathematics, and medicine. Essentially, a slow-motion exchange of "look what we made" across continents. Even the humble noodle may have taken its first journey along these paths, transforming eventually into Italians' beloved pasta. Though, to be fair, every culture on Earth seems to claim they invented noodles, so we'll let that one slide. Still, for all its glory, the Mongol Golden Age of trade didn't last. By the 14th century, the empire began to fragment, mostly because dividing an empire that large among too many ambitious grandsons never works out. The Silk Road, so dependent on strong central control, began to splinter. Local rulers reintroduced tolls and taxes. Bandits came back. Empires fought over borders. And as overland travel became risky again, a new generation of merchants started looking for alternatives, namely the sea. Now, this is where the Silk Road story begins to gently drift into decline, not with a crash, but a long, slow exhale. Because the 14th century brought something new and shiny, ships that could actually make it across oceans. Portuguese and Spanish explorers, armed with maps, compasses, and frankly questionable motives, began sailing around Africa and across the Atlantic. Why bother with dusty caravans and unpredictable bandits when you could load everything onto a boat and let the wind do the work? It was faster, cheaper, and didn't require bribing 10 different regional governors. So, as maritime routes flourished, the great overland Silk Road slowly fell silent. That said, the Silk Road didn't just vanish overnight. It lingered, like an old melody still humming faintly under the noise of new empires. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, and Kashgar continued as regional centers, though their cosmopolitan glow dimmed. By the time European merchants were sailing to India and China directly, the ancient roads had turned into quiet, fading paths. The caravans grew fewer, the desert took back what was once a global highway. And with that, thousands of years of slow, deliberate human movement, of camels and coins and stories, began to fade into memory. Still, the legacy remained. The Silk Road wasn't just about trade. It was about the invisible threads that tied civilizations together. Without it, Buddhism might never have reached China. Paper might have stayed an obscure Chinese invention. Gunpowder might never have sparked the Renaissance. It was humanity's first great experiment in globalization, messy, beautiful, often tragic, but deeply connective. In a sense, we still live in its shadow. Every shipping lane, every trade deal, every globalized supply chain, they're all descendants of that ancient road carved into sand and mountain. And if you think about it, it's almost poetic. The Silk Road began with silk, fragile, delicate, shimmering, something made from the labor of tiny worms and human patience. And yet, it connected half the planet. Maybe that's the metaphor history was quietly writing all along, that the thinnest threads can sometimes hold the world together. So, as we close this journey, imagine yourself somewhere along that vast route, maybe in an inn in Kashgar, listening to distant camel bells. Outside, the wind moves through the sand, carrying faint echoes of languages that no one speaks anymore. And for a moment, the whole ancient world feels small, quiet, and strangely familiar. Because history doesn't really go away, it just changes shape. That's it for How the Silk Road Changed the World. If you're still awake, congratulations. If not, well, that's kind of the point. Thanks for wandering the ancient highways with me tonight. Sleep well, dream of distant deserts, and I'll see you next time, somewhere between history and half-consciousness.